My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 29 I thought being called the family disappointment was the worst humiliation I'd ever face. Growing up wealthy in Boston, I'd already scandalized my parents by choosing teaching over law school and rejecting their world of status and privilege. But nothing prepared me for my wedding day, when my own sister stood up in front of 300 guests and screamed that I was worthless for marrying a man she dismissed as just a waiter. The shame should have crushed me as Victoria stormed out laughing, but then my husband-to-be leaned close and whispered something that made my heart stop. The secret he'd been hiding for 18 months wasn't just shocking, it would transform my family's cruelest moment into the sweetest revenge imaginable. What happens when the person everyone underestimates holds all the cards? Sometimes the most extraordinary truths come wrapped in the most ordinary disguises, and sometimes justice arrives exactly when you need it most. Let me take you back to where it began. Standing in my tiny one-bedroom apartment in Boston's Back Bay, surrounded by construction paper turkeys my fourth graders had made for Thanksgiving, I could almost forget that just 10 miles away in Beacon Hill my family was probably discussing my latest failure over their evening cocktails. The apartment wasn't much to look at. Mismatched furniture from yard sales, bookshelves overflowing with children's literature, and walls covered in student artwork that most people would call clutter, but I called joy. It was nothing like the sprawling colonial mansion I grew up in, with its perfectly manicured gardens and rooms that looked like they belonged in Architectural Digest. But this little space was mine, bought with my teacher's salary and decorated with love instead of an interior designer's vision. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, and I saw my mother's name flash across the screen, Catherine Mitchell. Even her contact photo looked disapproving, taken at some charity gala where she wore pearls that cost more than my car. I let it go to voicemail. 3 minutes later, it buzzed again. This time, it was Victoria. My younger sister, by 2 years, Victoria had always been everything our parents wanted in a daughter. At 27, she was a successful PR executive at Morrison & Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious firms. She had the perfect blonde hair that never seemed to frizz in humidity, the kind of effortless elegance that made expensive clothes look even more expensive. And most importantly, she had never once disappointed Robert and Catherine Mitchell. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. "Fine," I answered. "Your presence is requested at dinner tomorrow night," Victoria announced, without so much as a hello. "Mother specifically asked me to call since you've been avoiding her." I wasn't avoiding anyone. I've been busy with parent-teacher conferences. Victoria's laugh was sharp. "Oh, Sarah! Still playing with children instead of building a real career." I felt the familiar sting, but I'd learned to hide it years ago. Teaching is a real career, Victoria. Some of us find fulfillment in work that matters. Of course. How noble of you. Anyway, 7 o'clock tomorrow. Don't be late, and please try to wear something that doesn't look like it came from a thrift store. She hung up before I could respond. I set the phone down and looked around my apartment again. The walls seemed smaller somehow, the cheerful student artwork suddenly looking childish rather than charming. This was the problem with my family. 5 minutes of contact, and I was right back to being 16 years old, desperately trying to earn approval that would never come. The thing is, it hadn't always been this way. When Victoria and I were little, before the comparisons started, we used to be close. I remembered building blanket forts together, sharing secrets, protecting each other from the thunder that scared us both. But somewhere along the way, probably around the time Victoria started getting straight A's, and I started bringing home art projects instead of academic awards, everything changed. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the street below. A group of kids was playing hopscotch on the sidewalk, their laughter drifting up through the glass. Tomorrow I'd see my own students, 24 fourth graders, who thought I hung the moon just because I made learning fun. They didn't care that I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic or that my clothes came from Target. They cared that I remembered when their hamsters died and that I always had Band-Aids decorated with cartoon characters. but my family saw it differently. To them, I was the daughter who had thrown away a full scholarship to Harvard Law School to get an education degree from Boston University. I was the one who chose a cramped apartment over the trust fund that came with strings attached. I was the one who had consistently chosen passion over prestige, and in the Mitchell family that was the ultimate sin. The worst part was how they made me feel about Victoria. I loved my sister, truly I did. But loving someone who constantly reminded you of your inadequacies was exhausting. Victoria didn't even mean to be cruel most of the time. She simply existed in a world where worth was measured by salary figures and social connections, and in that world I would always be worthless. I remember the exact moment I realized this. It was my 16th birthday party, and I had invited a boy from school named Tommy Chen. He wasn't rich like the other boys my parents approved of, but he was kind and funny, and he actually listened when I talked about books I loved. He'd shown up to the party with a carefully wrapped present, a vintage copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that he'd found at a used bookstore, with a handwritten note about why he thought I'd love it. Victoria had taken one look at him, then at his gift, and announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Is that all you could afford, Sarah? Your standards are honestly embarrassing." Tommy had left early that night, and I'd never heard from him again. But Victoria's words had stayed with me, echoing in my head every time I made a choice that put happiness over status. They echoed now as I prepared for another family dinner, where I'd be reminded once again of how I'd failed to live up to the Mitchell name. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patricia Hayes, the principal at Lincoln Elementary. "Need to see you first thing Monday morning. Important budget discussion." My stomach dropped. Budget discussions in public schools rarely meant good news, especially with all the cuts the district had been making. I loved my job, loved my students, but I also knew how precarious teaching positions could be when money got tight. I set the phone aside and tried to push the worry away. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight I had papers to grade and lessons to plan. Tomorrow night I'd sit through another family dinner where I'd be reminded of all the ways I'd disappointed them. What I didn't know then was that my life was about to change in ways I never could have imagined. In just a few weeks I'd meet someone who would make me question everything I thought I knew about worth and value. Someone who would show me that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the disappointment everyone had convinced me I was. But first I had to survive dinner with the Mitchells. The family dinner happened exactly as I expected it would. 2 hours of passive-aggressive comments disguised as concerned criticism, wrapped in silk and enough tension to choke on. By the time I escaped back to my apartment, I needed something to wash the taste of disappointment from my mouth. Emma Rodriguez saved me from spending the evening replaying every cutting remark. My fellow fourth-grade teacher and closest friend called just as I was debating whether to grade papers or eat ice cream straight from the container. "You sound terrible," she said without preamble. "What did your family do this time?" "The usual." Victoria reminded me I'm wasting my potential, my mother asked, when I'm going to find a nice lawyer to marry, and my father spent dinner explaining why public education is a drain on society. Emma made a disgusted noise. "Screw them. You know what you need. You need to get out of that apartment and remember that there's a whole world of people who actually appreciate teachers. I'm fine, really. I just want to curl up with a book and pretend today didn't happen. Nope, not happening. Remember how you covered my classes when I had food poisoning last month? Now it's payoff time. We're going to dinner at that fancy place downtown Meridian. My treat. Emma, I can't let you spend that kind of money. I got a bonus for the after-school program I've been running. Besides, when's the last time you did something nice for yourself? I couldn't remember, which was probably her point. An hour later, I stood outside Meridian, feeling completely out of place in my simple black dress and cardigan. The restaurant looked like something from a magazine, all warm lighting and elegant decor. Through the windows I could see women in designer clothes and men in expensive suits, the kind of people who belonged in places like this. Emma looked perfect as always, her dark hair sleek and her confidence unshakable. She linked her arm through mine and pulled me toward the entrance. "Stop looking like you're about to face a firing squad. It's just dinner." The hostess led us to a corner table with a view of the city lights. I felt like an imposter among the crystal glasses and starched white tablecloths, but Emma seemed completely at ease, chatting about our students as if we were sitting in the school cafeteria instead of Boston's most expensive restaurant. That's when he appeared at our table. "Good evening, ladies. My name is David, and I'll be your server tonight." I looked up and felt something shift inside my chest. He was tall with broad shoulders and warm brown eyes that seemed to actually see me, not just look through me the way most people did. His smile was genuine, not the practiced politeness I was used to from service workers dealing with difficult customers. "Is this your first time dining with us?" he asked. And his attention seemed focused on me despite addressing both of us. "Yes," I managed to say, suddenly aware that my throat felt dry. "Any recommendations?" What followed wasn't the standard recitation of specials I'd expected. Instead, David spoke about each dish like he was telling a story. He explained where the salmon was sourced, described the perfect wine pairing for the duck, and somehow intuited exactly what flavors would appeal to each of us. "For you," he said, looking directly at me, "I'd recommend the braised short ribs with the cherry reduction. It has this beautiful balance of richness and brightness. Something tells me you appreciate when seemingly simple things have hidden complexity." Emma raised an eyebrow at me across the table, clearly amused by the attention I was getting. Throughout the meal, David checked on us with just the right frequency. He never hovered, but somehow always appeared exactly when we needed something. When I mentioned the challenging day I'd had, he asked thoughtful questions about teaching that showed he actually understood what the job entailed. "You work with fourth graders. That's incredible. That's such a crucial age for developing critical thinking skills. How do you balance creativity with the standardized testing requirements?" I found myself talking more freely than I had in months, describing my classroom projects and the small victories that made the difficult days worthwhile. David listened with genuine interest, occasionally offering insights that revealed an understanding of education policy that surprised me. When he brought our entrees, he lingered for a moment longer than necessary. "You know," he said, "what you do matters more than most people realize. Shaping young minds, helping kids discover their potential, it takes real courage to choose a profession that's about service rather than profit." No one in my family had ever said anything like that to me. During the main course, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression shifting slightly, then excused himself to take the call. Through the restaurant's windows, I could see him pacing near the kitchen entrance, his conversation animated but too distant to hear. "Okay," Emma said, the moment he was out of earshot. "What was that?" "What was what?" "That man is completely smitten with you, and don't think I didn't notice you hanging on his every word. He's just being professional." Professional servers don't usually discuss education policy or compliment your life choices. "He's been looking at you like you're the most fascinating person in this restaurant." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "He's probably just being nice because we seem out of place here." Emma shook her head. "Trust me, I know the difference between polite and interested. That man is interested." When David returned, he seemed slightly distracted, but his attention quickly refocused on our table. As the evening wound down and he brought our check, he hesitated for a moment. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," he said, his confidence wavering for the first time all evening. "But would you like to get coffee sometime? When I'm not working, of course." My heart did something acrobatic in my chest. I hadn't been asked on a date in over a year, and never by someone who looked at me the way David did, like I was worth getting to know. "I'd like that," I heard myself say. He smiled, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. As we walked back to my car, Emma was practically bouncing with excitement. "See, I told you that you needed to get out of your apartment. When's the last time a man looked at you like that? I couldn't remember. Maybe never." Driving home through the quiet Boston streets, I found myself thinking about the way David had listened when I talked about my students, how he'd made me feel like my work mattered, like I mattered. For the first time in months, the voices in my head weren't my family's disappointed sighs or Victoria's cutting remarks. Instead, I heard David's voice saying that what I did took courage, Back in my apartment, surrounded by the same mismatched furniture and student artwork, everything looked different somehow. Brighter, more hopeful. I had no idea that this feeling, this flutter of possibility, would soon turn my entire world upside down in ways I never could have imagined. Our first date wasn't what I expected at all. David picked me up on a Saturday morning in February, bundled up against the Boston cold, and instead of taking me to another restaurant or a typical coffee shop, he drove us to a small gallery in Somerville that was showcasing local artists. "I thought this might interest you," he said, as we walked through the converted warehouse space, given your passion for education. All the proceeds go to support art programs in underserved schools. The paintings and sculptures were beautiful, but what struck me more was how David moved through the space. He didn't just look at the art, he studied it, discussing brush techniques and color theory with a knowledge that seemed far beyond casual interest. When we stopped in front of a vibrant mural depicting children reading, he was quiet for a long moment. "This reminds me of why your work matters so much," he said. "Art education, they're both about opening minds to possibilities people didn't know existed." I found myself staring at his profile instead of the artwork. Who was this man who could discuss wine pairings and education policy with equal sophistication, who chose meaningful experiences over expensive displays? Over the next 2 months, our relationship developed in ways that surprised me. David was unlike anyone I'd ever dated. The wealthy men my parents had pushed on me talked about their portfolios and vacation homes. David asked about my students, remembered their names, wanted to know about the books I was reading to them. When I mentioned that one of my kids, Marcus, was struggling with reading comprehension, David spent an entire evening helping me brainstorm creative ways to engage him. When little Sophie's parents were going through a divorce and she was acting out in class, David listened to me work through strategies with the patience of someone who genuinely cared about the outcome. But there were things about David that puzzled me. His phone rang constantly and he always stepped away to take the calls, returning with vague explanations about work scheduling or vendor meetings. When I asked about his apartment, he consistently deflected with jokes about messy roommates and promises that we'd go there soon. One evening in March, we were walking along the Charles River when his phone rang for the 3rd time in an hour. He glanced at the screen and I caught a flash of something that might have been stress or frustration. "I'm sorry, this is important. Give me just a minute." I watched him pace near the water's edge, his conversation animated and clearly serious. Even from a distance, his body language looked more executive than employee, more like someone giving orders than taking them. When he returned, I couldn't help myself. "That sounded pretty intense for restaurant business." David ran a hand through his hair. "It's complicated. The hospitality industry has a lot of moving parts. Vendors, suppliers, scheduling. Sometimes servers get pulled into discussions about operations." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. The mysteries multiplied over the weeks that followed. David's knowledge seemed impossibly broad for someone who spent his days taking food orders. When we watched the news together, he offered insights into economic trends that would have impressed my father. When we visited museums, he could discuss historical contexts and artistic movements with the fluency of someone with graduate degrees. One Saturday, we were browsing a bookstore in Harvard Square when I mentioned my concerns about upcoming budget cuts at Lincoln Elementary. Dr. Hayes had called another meeting, and I was increasingly worried about my job security. David listened intently as I explained the district's financial pressures, then surprised me with detailed questions about federal education funding and state allocation formulas. "How do you know so much about this?" I asked. He smiled, that same mysterious smile I was beginning to recognize. "I read a lot. And I listen. You'd be amazed what you can learn just by paying attention to the world around you." But it wasn't just his knowledge that puzzled me. There were the expensive gifts he brushed off as good deals or bonuses, the way restaurant managers and even some customers seemed to treat him with unusual deference, the business cards I occasionally glimpsed him exchanging with well-dressed people who definitely weren't in the service industry. Emma noticed it too. She'd joined us for dinner a couple of times, and afterward always peppered me with questions. Sarah, that man knows way too much about wine importing and hospitality management for someone who just takes orders. And did you see how the sommelier at that French place practically bowed when he saw David? I had noticed, but I'd chosen to ignore it. David treated me with a respect and kindness I'd never experienced before. He made me feel valued for exactly who I was, not who someone else wanted me to be. If he had secrets, I trusted they weren't malicious ones. Still, the questions nagged at me, especially when he mentioned needing to travel for work. Restaurant consulting, he explained when I asked what kind of travel a server would need to do. Some of the bigger hospitality groups like to have experienced floor staff evaluate their operations. It's good money and helps me understand the business better. The explanation made sense, but something about the way he delivered it felt carefully constructed, like he'd thought about this conversation before having it. That night, as I lay in bed replaying our date, I realized I was falling in love with David despite not fully understanding who he was. Or maybe because of it. For someone who'd grown up in a family where everything was surface level, where worth was measured by visible achievements and social connections, there was something thrilling about being with someone who had depth. I was still discovering. What I didn't know then was that David's secrets ran deeper than I could have possibly imagined, and that my family's disapproval was about to become the least of my concerns. The next morning, Dr. Hayes called with news that would change everything. The budget crisis at Lincoln Elementary was worse than anyone had anticipated, and the solutions being proposed would affect every teacher in the district. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that my carefully constructed life was about to fall apart in ways I wasn't prepared for. 5 months into our relationship, I finally worked up the courage to bring David home to meet my family. The decision came after weeks of my mother's increasingly pointed questions about my mysterious boyfriend, and Victoria's none too subtle hints that she was starting to investigate him herself. I spent the entire drive to Beacon Hill coaching David on what to expect, trying to prepare him for the gauntlet he was about to face. Just remember, they're going to try to intimidate you. My father will ask about your career prospects, my mother will make comments about your background, and Victoria will probably say something cutting just to see how you react. David reached over and squeezed my hand. I can handle difficult people, Sarah. I serve them dinner every night. Remember, if only it were that simple. The Mitchell family mansion looked exactly as imposing as I'd warned him it would, with its red brick facade and perfectly manicured gardens that probably cost more to maintain than most people's salaries. Catherine had pulled out all the stops for the evening, using the good china and crystal that only appeared when she wanted to remind people of their place in the social hierarchy. Robert stood in the foyer, holding a glass of whiskey that probably cost more than David's weekly rent, his tailored suit and cold assessment, making it clear this was going to be an interrogation disguised as dinner. "So you're the famous David," he said, extending his hand, with the kind of grip designed to establish dominance. "Sarah's been very secretive about you." David shook his hand, firmly meeting Robert's stare without flinching. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir." Sarah speaks about her family often. Catherine appeared in a cloud of expensive perfume and subtle disapproval air, kissing my cheeks before turning her attention to David with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Welcome to our home, David. I do hope you'll be comfortable. We're so curious to learn more about you." Victoria made her entrance fashionably late, sweeping into the dining room in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She looked David up and down, with unconcealed assessment-taking in his simple but well-fitted suit and modest watch. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, settling into her chair with practiced grace. "Work was absolutely insane today. Some clients just don't understand the value of good public relations." The emphasis on value was clearly intentional. Dinner began civilly enough with polite questions about David's background and work. He handled the interrogation with remarkable calm, providing consistent answers about his middle-class upbringing in Chicago, his business courses, and his goals in the hospitality industry. "So, you're a server," Robert said, stating it like a medical diagnosis. "And is this a temporary situation while you pursue other goals?" "I enjoy my work," David replied evenly. It allows me to interact with interesting people and learn about different aspects of the hospitality industry. Victoria practically purred with satisfaction. How refreshing. It's so rare to meet someone who's comfortable with service work these days. The conversation continued in this vein throughout the first course, with my parents asking increasingly pointed questions about David's education, his family's background, and his 5-year plan. David answered everything with patience and dignity, never rising to the bait or showing frustration. But I could feel the tension building like a storm front moving in. The breaking point came during the main course, when the conversation turned to my career choices. Catherine was lamenting my decision to teach instead of pursuing law, wondering aloud where she'd gone wrong in raising me. Sarah has always been idealistic, she said, with the kind of sigh reserved for discussing terminal illnesses. We'd hoped she'd eventually come to her senses about her career choices. Victoria seized the opening like a shark scenting blood. Well, I think it's wonderful, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. My sister has finally found someone at her level. Not everyone is meant for greatness after all. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard variations of this theme my entire life, but hearing it said in front of David, seeing the look of satisfaction on Victoria's face as she delivered it, was more humiliating than anything she'd done before. David's response was immediate and firm. I find that ambition comes in many forms, he said, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. Sarah's commitment to shaping young minds is one of the most ambitious pursuits I can imagine. It takes real courage to choose fulfillment over status. Robert cleared his throat loudly, clearly uncomfortable with being challenged by someone he considered hired help. Yes, well, we'd hoped Sarah would eventually come to her senses about her career choices. Perhaps with the right influence. David set down his fork with deliberate precision. I think Sarah's sensibilities are just fine as they are. She knows what brings her joy, and she pursues it authentically. That's something to admire, not correct. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My parents exchanged glances across the table while Victoria's eyes glittered with something that looked like anticipation. The final blow came as we were finishing dessert. Victoria had been unusually quiet, building up to something, and when she finally spoke, her words were delivered with surgical precision. You know what I love most about this relationship, she said, addressing the table as if David weren't sitting right there. Sarah chose teaching when she could have joined Dad's firm, and now she's dating a waiter instead of someone with actual ambition. It's like she's determined to waste every advantage she's ever been given. The words worthless hung in the air unspoken, but we all heard them anyway. David placed his hand over mine under the table, a gesture of support that somehow gave me the strength to find my voice. Victoria, that's enough, but she wasn't finished. I mean, at least we know what we're dealing with now. No surprises, no pretensions, just Sarah being Sarah, choosing the easy path instead of challenging herself. David's response was calm but unmistakable. If standing up for what you believe in and choosing purpose over profit is the easy path, then I'd say Sarah has more courage than anyone else at this table. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents sat frozen, clearly shocked that someone they considered beneath them had the audacity to challenge their worldview. Victoria's face flushed with anger and something else, something that looked almost like fear. I think it's time for us to go, I managed to say, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and humiliation. As we gathered our coats in the foyer, my mother pulled me aside for what she probably thought was a private conversation. Darling, I know you think you're happy, but be realistic. What kind of future can you have with someone who serves food for a living? Before I could respond, my father joined us with his own version of concern. Sarah, you're a Mitchell. You could do so much better than this. Think about what you're throwing away. Standing there in the house where I'd grown up, surrounded by the luxury and privilege that had never brought any of us real happiness, I realized something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't ashamed of disappointing them. The drive back to my apartment was quiet until we were safely away from Beacon Hill. Then I broke down, completely apologizing over and over for my family's behavior. David pulled me into his arms right there in my tiny living room. Hey, it's okay. Their opinion of me doesn't matter. Only yours does. But they were horrible to you. They had no right. People who measure worth by status and money are often afraid of losing those things, he said thoughtfully. It makes them judge harshly. Sitting there in David's arms, I fell even deeper in love with him. He'd faced my family's worst behavior and emerged with his dignity intact while somehow helping me find mine in the process. What I didn't know then was that David had his own reasons for remaining so calm in the face of their judgment, reasons that would soon turn my understanding of everything upside down. March arrived with bad news that seemed to multiply by the day. Dr. Hayes called me into her office on a gray Monday morning, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by the kind of serious expression that made my stomach clench. The district's financial situation is worse than we initially thought, she said, sliding a folder across her desk. We're looking at significant budget cuts that will affect staffing levels across all schools. I opened the folder and felt my world tilt. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. Lincoln Elementary would lose 20% of its teaching positions by the end of the school year unless enrollment increased dramatically or new funding appeared. My position was on the preliminary list for elimination. I'm going to fight for you, Sarah, Dr. Hayes assured me. Your innovative programs and student engagement scores are among the best in the district, but I wanted you to know what we're facing so you can prepare. Driving home that afternoon, I felt the familiar weight of failure settling on my shoulders. Here I was, about to lose the job I loved, the one thing in my life that made me feel valuable and necessary. The voices in my head sounded suspiciously like my family. Maybe they'd been right all along. Maybe I should have taken that scholarship to Harvard Law School. Maybe choosing passion over security had been naive. David found me that evening sitting on my couch, still in my work clothes, staring at the termination. Notice I couldn't bring myself to put away. "What's wrong?" he asked, settling beside me with the kind of immediate concern that still surprised me after months of dating. I told him about the budget cuts, the potential job loss, the fear that everything I'd worked for was about to disappear. He listened without trying to fix anything, just letting me voice all the doubts and worries I'd been carrying. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "Have you considered that this might be an opportunity for the school to explore alternative funding sources? Corporate educational partnerships." For instance, I looked at him curiously. "What do you know about corporate partnerships?" He shifted slightly, that familiar evasiveness creeping into his expression. "You hear things in the restaurant business. Wealthy clients talking about their charitable foundations' tax write-offs for education initiatives. The hospitality industry often has connections to local school programs." It was a reasonable explanation, but there was something in the way he said it that made me wonder how much more David knew about business than he was letting on. Meanwhile, Victoria was conducting her own investigation into my relationship. She called 3 days after my job scare, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she thought she was being helpful. "I've been doing some research on your boyfriend," she announced without preamble. "Victoria, I really don't want to hear this. Just listen. I've been looking into David Williams online, and something doesn't add up. His social media presence is practically non-existent. No LinkedIn profile, no college information, barely any digital footprint at all. Maybe he values his privacy, or maybe he has something to hide. Sarah, I'm worried about you. This man shows up in your life with no verifiable background, and now you're talking about marrying him." I hadn't actually mentioned marriage, but Victoria had always been good at reading between the lines. "People can live without broadcasting their entire lives online, Victoria. Not everyone needs to document every career achievement and social event." But the seed of doubt had been planted. That evening, I found myself paying closer attention to David's phone calls, noticing how he always stepped away for privacy, how his conversations sounded more authoritative than I'd expect from someone taking orders all day. When I casually asked about his college experience, his answers were vague and general. When I mentioned Victoria's concerns about his online presence, he laughed it off. "Your sister really doesn't trust anyone, does she?" I prefer to keep my personal life private. In the service industry, you learn that some customers can become problematic if they have too much access to your personal information. It made sense, but it didn't entirely satisfy the questions that were starting to multiply in my mind. The situation at work continued to deteriorate. By the end of March, Dr. Hayes had confirmed that my position would definitely be eliminated unless a miracle occurred. The stress was affecting my sleep, my appetite, my ability to focus on anything other than the growing uncertainty about my future. David tried to be supportive, but I noticed he seemed distracted by his own work pressures. His phone rang more frequently, and his mysterious business trips became more common. I have to go to New York for a few days, he told me one Thursday evening. Some consulting work that could really help my career prospects. What kind of consulting does a server do in New York? The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I saw something flicker across his face. Restaurant groups often bring in experienced floor staff to evaluate their operations in different markets. It's actually pretty common in high-end hospitality. The explanation was smooth and confident, but I was starting to recognize the careful way he constructed these answers, as if he'd thought about these conversations before having them. That weekend, while David was in New York, Victoria called with more disturbing news. I hired someone to look into David's background professionally, she announced. A private investigator who specializes in background checks. Victoria, you had no right. I had every right to protect my sister from making a terrible mistake. And Sarah, what he found is troubling. David Williams exists, but barely. It's like someone created his identity out of thin air 3 years ago. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. What does that mean? It means either your boyfriend is hiding something major, or he's not who he says he is at all. The call ended with Victoria demanding I meet with her and the investigator, and me refusing to hear another word. But as I sat in my empty apartment surrounded by the life I'd built for myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I thought I knew was starting to unravel. When David returned from New York, he seemed different somehow. More relaxed, but also more secretive. He brought me an expensive bottle of wine that he claimed was a gift from a grateful restaurant manager, but the label suggested it cost more than he made in a week. The questions I'd been avoiding were becoming impossible to ignore, but I was terrified of what the answers might mean for us. The next morning, my phone rang with news that would change everything once again. Victoria's private investigator delivered his report on a rainy Tuesday morning in May. Michael Torres was a thin man in his late 20s, with a kind of quiet intensity that made me uncomfortable from the moment he walked into the coffee shop where Victoria had insisted we meet. Your boyfriend's background is clean but almost suspiciously, so he said, sliding a folder across the table. Employment records. Check out credit history. Is solid, but there's something manufactured about the whole package. I opened the folder, reluctantly seeing David's life reduced to a collection of documents and timeline charts. Everything looked legitimate on the surface, but Torres was right about something feeling off. His digital footprint before 2021 is practically non-existent, Torres continued. No college social media, no tagged photos, no online presence at all until he started working at Meridian. It's like David Williams didn't exist before 3 years ago. Victoria leaned forward eagerly. What does that usually mean in your experience? Either he's extremely privacy conscious, which is unusual for someone in his generation, or he's deliberately concealing his past. Could be witness protection, could be criminal history, could be identity theft. Without more invasive investigation methods, I can't determine which. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. This is insane. You're talking about David like he's some kind of criminal mastermind, instead of a guy who values his privacy. Sarah, Victoria said with that patronizing tone I'd heard my entire life. You're being naive. Normal people don't have backgrounds this carefully constructed. I stood up, my coffee untouched and my patience exhausted. I'm not going to sit here while you tear apart the man I love based on conspiracy theories and paranoia. But Victoria's words followed me home, adding to the growing collection of doubts I was trying to ignore. That evening, when David called to check on me, I found myself listening more carefully to the background sounds during our conversation. Instead of the typical restaurant noise I expected, I heard what sounded like office conversations and phone calls. When I mentioned it, David's explanation came quickly. "I'm at the corporate office today helping with some administrative work. They sometimes bring in experienced floor staff for training development." It was plausible, but, like so many of his explanations, it felt rehearsed. Meanwhile, my father was dealing with his own crisis that would soon intersect with my relationship in ways none of us anticipated. Robert's behavior had been increasingly erratic over the past month, and I learned why when Catherine called me in tears. "Your father is being investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission," she whispered into the phone, as if saying it quietly would make it less real. "They think he's been moving client funds inappropriately." The investigation had been going on for weeks, apparently triggered by a whistleblower complaint about irregularities in client accounts. Robert was facing the possibility of criminal charges, the collapse of Mitchell & Sons, and the destruction of everything he'd spent his life building. Suddenly, his desperate attempts to control my relationship made more sense. A wealthy son-in-law might provide the kind of business connections and financial backing that could save his firm. But a server offered nothing except another reminder of his daughter's disappointing choices. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family was judging David for his supposed lack of prospects, their own carefully constructed world of wealth and status was crumbling around them. David continued to be supportive about my job situation, offering suggestions about alternative funding sources with the kind of detailed knowledge that made me wonder where a restaurant server would learn about corporate philanthropic strategies. When I mentioned that several other teachers were also facing layoffs, he seemed genuinely concerned about the broader implications for public education. "The system is failing these kids," he said one evening as we walked through Boston Common. "Schools shouldn't have to beg for basic funding while administrators drive luxury cars and live in mansions." There was something personal in his voice when he said it, like he was speaking from experience rather than observation. That weekend, David proposed we start looking at wedding venues, which should have been the happiest conversation of our relationship. Instead, it became another source of confusion when he suggested the Four Seasons. "David, that's completely out of our budget. We talked about something simple, maybe the botanical garden." "Let me worry about the cost," he said, with that mysterious confidence I was learning to recognize. "I have some connections in the hospitality industry that might help us get a better rate." The idea that a server had connections that could secure discounts at Boston's most exclusive hotel seemed increasingly unlikely, but I was tired of questioning everything. I wanted to trust the man I loved, to believe that his explanations made sense, even when they didn't quite add up. We made an appointment to tour the Four Seasons the following week, and I spent the intervening days trying to ignore the voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like Victoria, asking how any of this was possible. The morning of our venue visit, David received another of his mysterious phone calls. This one lasted nearly an hour, and through the bathroom door I could hear him discussing what sounded like complex business negotiations. When he emerged, he seemed energized in a way I'd never seen before. "Good news about work?" I asked. He smiled, that enigmatic smile that was becoming his signature expression. "Something like that. I think things are about to change for us in ways you can't imagine." As we drove to the Four Seasons that afternoon, I realized I was about to commit to marrying a man whose background I was only beginning to question. The smart thing would have been to postpone everything until I had answers to the growing list of inconsistencies in his story. Instead, I chose to trust my heart over my head, not knowing that decision would soon lead to the most humiliating and revealing moment of my life. The meeting at the Four Seasons should have been a simple venue tour. Instead, it became another layer of mystery that I couldn't ignore. The events coordinator, a polished woman named Margaret, greeted us in the lobby with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for celebrity clients. "Mr. Chen," she said, extending her hand to David with obvious recognition. "What a pleasure to have you back. We're so excited to help you plan your special day." I felt my eyebrows raise. back, David had never mentioned visiting the Four Seasons before, let alone being recognized by staff. David's response was smooth but didn't address my confusion. "Thank you, Margaret. We're looking forward to seeing what options you have available." As we toured the ballroom spaces, Margaret's deference to David became increasingly obvious. She offered premium upgrade packages without being asked, mentioned complimentary services that weren't part of standard wedding contracts, and spoke about dates and pricing as if cost were no object. For the grand ballroom, we could arrange the crystal chandelier setup you admired last time, plus the premium floral package. Normally there's a waiting list, but for you, Mr. Chen, I'm sure we can accommodate your timeline. David nodded as if this were perfectly normal while I stood there, trying to process when a restaurant server would have had previous occasions to admire crystal chandelier setups at Boston's most expensive hotel. On the drive home, I couldn't contain my confusion any longer. "David, how does the events coordinator at the Four Seasons know you, and what did she mean about you being there?" Before his answer came with the same practiced ease I was learning to recognize. "I've worked events there as part of consulting projects. High-end hotels often bring in experienced hospitality staff to observe their operations during major functions. Margaret probably remembers me from one of those occasions." The explanation was logical enough, but it didn't explain why she'd treated him like a valued client rather than a temporary consultant. Meanwhile, my work situation reached its final crisis point. Dr. Hayes called me into her office the day after our Four Seasons visit with the news I'd been dreading. "Sarah, I'm so sorry, but the budget cuts are finalized. Your position will be eliminated at the end of this school year." I sat in her office, fighting back tears, watching 24 little faces in my mind, knowing I'd have to tell them I wouldn't be their teacher anymore. The job that had given my life, meaning the work that had made me feel valuable despite my family's disappointment, was disappearing. "There is one potential development," Dr. Hayes continued carefully. "We've received an inquiry from an anonymous donor interested in funding our arts and literacy programs. If it goes through, we might be able to save not just your position, but expand the programs significantly." An anonymous donor? What kind of inquiry? The preliminary contact came through a corporate foundation. They're specifically interested in supporting innovative teaching methods and want to fund programs that help underserved students. The timing is unusual, but the interest seems genuine. I left that meeting with a mixture of hope and bewilderment. Anonymous donors didn't usually appear just when they were needed most, especially not ones interested in the exact type of programs I'd been developing. That evening, David seemed unusually interested in my day at school. "How are things going with the budget situation?" he asked, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. There might be some hope. An anonymous donor is interested in funding our programs. David's reaction was subtle but noticeable. A flash of something that might have been satisfaction crossed his face before he arranged his features into appropriate concern. "That's wonderful news. Do you know anything about this donor?" "Not really. It's all very mysterious. Sometimes the best help comes from unexpected sources," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made me wonder if he knew more than he was letting on. By this time, Victoria had escalated her campaign against David into what could only be called active surveillance. She'd been following him, she told me, during one of her increasingly frantic phone calls, and had photographed him meeting with people who definitely weren't restaurant employees. "Sarah, I have pictures of your boyfriend having lunch with the CEO of North Point Development and dinner with someone from the Hartwell Foundation. These aren't casual encounters. He's conducting business meetings with some of the most powerful people in Boston." When I confronted David about this, his explanations became more elaborate but less convincing. The hospitality industry intersects with a lot of different businesses: real estate development, charitable foundations, corporate events. It's not unusual for experienced restaurant staff to consult on venue selection and event planning. But Victoria's photographs told a different story. In them, David wasn't acting like a consultant providing advice. He was clearly leading conversations, making decisions, carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. Emma, who had remained supportively neutral throughout the growing chaos of my relationship, finally spoke up during one of our after-school planning sessions. "Sarah, I love that you're happy, but something isn't adding up here. The way David talks about business, the connections he seems to have, the mysterious phone calls. Either he's not who he says he is, or he's involved in something he's not telling you about." I wanted to defend him, but the evidence was becoming overwhelming. David's stories didn't match his knowledge, his connections didn't align with his supposed position, and his behavior suggested someone with far more authority and resources than a restaurant server should possess. The breaking point came when we finalized our wedding date for July. David had insisted on handling most of the arrangements himself, claiming his industry connections made everything easier. When the preliminary guest list arrived from the Four Seasons, I nearly choked. 312 confirmed attendees. "David, we invited about 100 people. Who are all these other guests?" He glanced at the list with what I was beginning to recognize as carefully feigned surprise. "Those must be industry colleagues and business associates who heard about the wedding. It's actually pretty common in hospitality. People like to celebrate with their professional network." But as I scanned the names, I recognized several from business magazines and newspaper articles. CEOs, investment bankers, hotel magnates, people who had no reason to know a restaurant server, let alone attend his wedding. The final straw came the next morning when I received a call from someone identifying himself as James Morrison, CEO of Morrison Hotels. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I wanted to personally apologize for any distress my employee Victoria may have caused your family during this happy time." Morrison Hotels employed Victoria. But why would her CEO be calling about our family situation? "I understand there may have been some misunderstanding about your fiancé's background," Morrison continued. "I want to assure you that Mr. Chen has my complete respect and admiration. I look forward to seeing you both at the wedding." The call ended before I could ask the questions that were screaming in my head. How did Victoria's boss know David? Why was he apologizing for Victoria's behavior? And most importantly, who exactly was I about to marry? That night, lying awake next to David as he slept peacefully beside me, I realized I was about to walk down the aisle to marry a man whose identity I was only beginning to question. The final month before the wedding brought revelations that should have prepared me for what was coming, but somehow I remained willfully blind to the truth. James Morrison's phone call had shaken me, but when I tried to discuss it with David, he deflected with his usual skill. "Morrison Hotels does a lot of business with various restaurant groups. Mr. Morrison probably knows me through professional connections. The hospitality industry in Boston is smaller than you'd think." But his explanation didn't account for the personal nature of Morrison's apology, or why Victoria's boss felt responsible for her behavior toward my fiancé. The anonymous donor situation at Lincoln Elementary had resolved in the most miraculous way possible. Dr. Hayes called me with news that seemed too good to be true. "Sarah, the funding came through. Not just enough to save your position, but enough to expand our arts and literacy programs for the next 5 years. The donor wants to remain anonymous, but they've specifically requested that you lead the new initiative." I should have been purely happy about this development, but something nagged at me about the timing. The donor had appeared exactly when I needed help most, had funded exactly the type of programs I'd been advocating for, and had specifically requested my involvement. It felt less like coincidence and more like intervention. When I shared the news with David, his reaction was enthusiastic but unsurprising, as if he'd expected this outcome. "That's incredible, Sarah. See, sometimes the universe provides exactly what you need when you need it most." There was something in his tone that made me study his face more carefully. He looked pleased but not shocked, satisfied rather than surprised. Moving into the bridal suite at the Four Seasons 2 days before the wedding should have been the most exciting part of the entire process. Instead, it became another source of confusion. The suite was massive, with a view of Boston Harbor and amenities that definitely weren't part of any standard wedding package. The staff treated me like royalty from the moment I arrived, addressing me as Mrs., Chen, and offering services I hadn't requested. When I mentioned that my name was still Mitchell, the front desk manager looked genuinely confused. "Oh, I apologize. The reservation shows Miss Chen and we were told you'd be staying under that name." I hadn't made the reservation, and David wasn't officially a Chen as far as I knew. When I asked him about it, he claimed it was a simple mix-up with the hotel's system. You know how these places are with their computer systems. Probably got confused with another wedding party. But the staff's behavior suggested this wasn't a computer error. They knew exactly who they thought I was, and whoever that was commanded a level of service that went far beyond what a restaurant server's fiancé should receive. My family's final attempt at intervention came the night before the wedding. They appeared at my bridal suite like an unwelcome delegation, with Robert looking haggard from his legal troubles and Catherine wringing her hands with anxiety. "Sarah, we need to talk," Robert began without preamble. "We've learned some things about David that you need to know." Victoria stepped forward with a folder that looked suspiciously like the investigative report I'd refused to read weeks earlier. The private investigator found connections between David and some major business figures in the city. He's been photographed with people who don't associate with restaurant workers. "There's something he's not telling you." I looked at the three of them standing in my beautiful suite, their faces filled with the kind of concern that came too late to be convincing. "You've spent months treating David like he wasn't good enough for this family, and now you want me to believe you're trying to protect me." Catherine moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Darling, we know we handled things badly, but what if we're right? What if there's something dangerous about his background?" Robert, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "Sarah, I'm facing federal charges. Our family's reputation is already destroyed. I'm not trying to control you anymore. I'm trying to warn you that the man you're marrying might not be who he claims to be." There was something different about my father's tone, a humility I'd never heard before. But it was too late for their concern to carry weight with me. "Even if David has secrets," I said firmly, "he's shown me nothing but love and respect. That's more than I can say for any of you." Victoria made one last desperate attempt. "Sarah, what if he's using you? What if this whole relationship is some kind of elaborate con?" I asked them to leave, but their words followed them out of the suite. Standing alone in the opulent room surrounded by wedding preparations that had somehow materialized without my direct involvement, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what I'd been avoiding. David wasn't who he claimed to be. The evidence was overwhelming, from his impossible connections to his sophisticated knowledge to the way powerful people treated him with deference rather than dismissal. But instead of being angry about the deception, I found myself curious about the truth. Who was the man I was about to marry? And why had he chosen to hide his real identity from me that night? As I lay in the enormous bed in my luxury suite, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would marry David Williams, or whoever he really was, and trust that his reasons for secrecy were honorable. I'd spent my entire life being judged by appearances and status, so how could I do the same thing to him? What I didn't know was that my family's interference had set other wheels in motion. Victoria's investigation had attracted attention from people who had their own reasons for wanting to know David's true identity. The wedding that was supposed to be our private celebration was about to become a very public revelation. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear activity in the hotel corridors, the sounds of preparation for what promised to be the most significant day of my life. I had no idea that by tomorrow evening, everything I thought I knew about love, family, and my own worth would be completely transformed. The morning of my wedding day was about to bring answers I'd never thought to ask for, and consequences none of us had anticipated. July 15th arrived with perfect summer weather that mocked my churning stomach. I woke up in the luxury suite to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the sound of Emma bustling around the sitting area, organizing flowers and coordinating with the hair and makeup team. "Today's the day," she said with forced cheerfulness as she brought me coffee. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," I admitted, which was the first honest thing I'd said in weeks. Terrified about marrying David, or terrified about what your family might do? Both, I realized. Neither. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her expression serious for the first time since she'd arrived. "Sarah, it's not too late if you're having doubts. Real doubts, not just wedding day nerves." I shook my head. "I love him, Emma. Whatever secrets he's keeping, I trust that his feelings for me are real." The hair and makeup artists arrived shortly after transforming me into a bride who looked confident even if she didn't feel it. My dress was simple but elegant, an A-line silhouette with delicate lace detail that I'd chosen specifically because it felt like me rather than what my mother would have preferred. As we prepared to leave the suite, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was about to marry a man whose real name she might not even know, and somehow she looked ready for whatever came next. The Four Seasons ballroom had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Cascading orchids and white roses created an enchanted garden atmosphere, with crystal chandeliers dimmed to cast romantic shadows across the space. The elegance was breathtaking and completely beyond what our supposed budget should have allowed. Emma walked me to the bridal preparation room, where I could hear the growing murmur of guests arriving. Through the door's window, I caught glimpses of people I didn't recognize, men and women in expensive clothing who carried themselves with the confidence of serious wealth and power. "Your family's here," Emma reported after checking the ceremony space. "They look nervous, but they're behaving themselves. Victoria seems unusually subdued." When it was time for the processional, Robert appeared at the preparation room door, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The federal investigation had aged him years, in a matter of months, and his usual arrogance had been replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," he said, offering his arm. "Are you ready for this?" I nodded, though ready seemed like an inadequate word for what I was feeling. The ceremony music began and the doors opened to reveal a ballroom filled with over 300 guests. As we walked down the aisle, I noticed faces I recognized from business magazines and newspaper articles mixed among my invited guests. James Morrison sat in the third row, watching the proceedings with obvious interest. Several other men and women who looked like corporate executives filled seats throughout the ballroom. But all of that faded when I saw David waiting at the altar. He looked devastatingly handsome in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, but more than that, he looked nervous in a way I'd never seen before. When our eyes met, his expression shifted to something that looked almost like relief. The officiant began the ceremony with traditional words about love and commitment, but I barely heard them. I was too focused on David's face, trying to read the emotions playing across his features. He looked like a man about to be freed from a burden he'd carried too long. We made it through the opening remarks and readings without incident. My parents sat stiffly in the front row, while Victoria fidgeted beside them, occasionally glancing around the room with obvious confusion about the guest list. When we reached the exchange of vows, David took my hands and began speaking with an intensity that made the rest of the room disappear. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom, "you loved me when you thought I had nothing to offer but myself. You defended my character when others judged me by my supposed profession. You chose me for who I am, not what I could give you." There were knowing murmurs from the crowd that I didn't understand, but David continued with growing confidence. "I promise to spend my life being worthy of that pure love, to support your dreams the way you've supported mine, and to never let status or wealth come between us and what really matters." As he finished his vows, I felt tears starting to form. Whatever secrets David was keeping, his love for me was undeniable. Then it was my turn to speak, but before I could begin, Victoria suddenly stood up from her seat in the front row. The movement was so abrupt and unexpected that conversations throughout the ballroom stopped mid-sentence. Victoria walked toward the center aisle, her face flushed with emotion and something that looked like desperation. "Stop this wedding!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the ballroom's high ceilings. "You are worthless, Sarah. You're marrying a waiter." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Victoria continued her tirade, her voice getting louder and more hysterical with each word. "This is absolutely pathetic. Everyone here needs to know my sister is throwing her life away on a nobody who serves food for a living. She could have been a lawyer married, someone successful, but instead she's worthless. The humiliation was complete and devastating. 300 guests, many of them strangers, watched as my sister declared me worthless on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I felt David's hand tighten around mine, anchoring me as my world threatened to collapse. Victoria turned toward the exit, her final words delivered with cruel satisfaction. "Enjoy your pathetic little life, Sarah. You've proven exactly how little you're worth." The heavy ballroom doors slammed behind her, leaving a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I stood frozen at the altar, tears streaming down my face, wanting nothing more than to disappear. That's when David leaned close and whispered something that would change everything. Should we tell her who I really am? Through my tears, I managed to shake my head. Let her go. Let her miss whatever was about to happen next. The officiant cleared his throat uncertainly. "Shall we continue with the ceremony?" I took a shaky breath and nodded. "Yes, please." As we completed our vows and exchanged rings, I noticed something strange happening in the ballroom. Instead of the pity and embarrassment I expected to see on our guests' faces, many people were watching us with anticipation, as if they knew something I didn't. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, David's kiss tasted like relief and freedom, and the promise of truth finally told. As we turned to face our audience as a married couple, I caught sight of James Morrison in the third row, and his expression looked almost apologetic, as if he knew exactly what Victoria had just missed. The reception was about to begin, and I had no idea that my understanding of everything was about to be completely transformed. The reception should have been a celebration, but I spent the first hour feeling like I was walking through someone else's dream. Victoria's words echoed in my head as I tried to smile and accept congratulations from guests whose names I didn't know and whose presence I couldn't explain. David led our first dance, while I struggled to process what had just happened. My sister had called me worthless in front of 300 people, many of them strangers, and then stormed out of my wedding. The humiliation should have been unbearable, but something in the way our guests were watching us suggested there was more to this story. During dinner, I began to notice patterns that made no sense. High-profile business leaders approached our table continuously, but they weren't offering sympathy for Victoria's outburst. Instead, they were congratulating David with the kind of respect and familiarity that spoke to long-established professional relationships. "Mr. Chen, what a beautiful ceremony," said a distinguished man I recognized from the business section of the Boston Globe. "Margaret, my wife, and I are so happy for you both." David accepted the congratulations, graciously introducing me with obvious pride, but I caught the way the man addressed him. "Mr. Chen, not David." And the deference in his tone suggested he was speaking to someone whose opinion mattered in business circles. A woman who looked like a corporate executive approached next, speaking to David about quarterly projections and market expansion, as if these were topics they discussed regularly. When she mentioned board meetings and strategic initiatives, David responded with the fluency of someone deeply involved in high-level business decisions. I watched this parade of interactions with growing amazement and confusion. These weren't casual acquaintances offering polite wedding wishes. These were substantial business relationships, the kind that took years to develop and millions of dollars to maintain. James Morrison appeared at our table during the main course, and his conversation with David was the most revealing yet. "David, I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience Victoria's behavior may have caused you or Chen Hospitality Empire," he said, with obvious concern. "I've spoken with her about the situation, and I want to assure you that Morrison Hotels values our relationship with your organization." I felt my world tilt sideways. Chen Hospitality Empire. Morrison was talking to David like he owned a company, not like he worked for one. David's response was measured, but carried unmistakable authority. "I appreciate that, James. Victoria's actions reflected her own issues, not any failure on your part. I hope this doesn't affect our working relationship going forward." Morrison looked visibly relieved. Not at all. In fact, I'd like to schedule a meeting next month to discuss the partnership opportunities we talked about. As Morrison walked away, I turned to David with questions screaming in my head, but he was already being approached by another group of business leaders who clearly knew him well. The pieces of an impossible puzzle were starting to form a picture I couldn't quite accept. David wasn't just acquainted with these people, he was conducting business with them, making decisions that affected their companies, wielding influence that no restaurant server could possibly possess. When dinner concluded, and David stood to make his speech, the entire ballroom fell silent, with an anticipation that felt charged with significance. I watched my husband, this man I'd thought I knew, transform before my eyes into someone completely different. "Thank you all for celebrating our love today," he began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to addressing large groups, especially Sarah's family, who had strong reservations about me. Knowing laughter rippled through the crowd, and I realized that most of our guests understood something I was only beginning to grasp. "For those who know me through business, thank you for keeping my secret these past 18 months. Your discretion allowed me to experience something I never thought possible." My heart started pounding as the implications of his words sank in. "For those who don't know me well, particularly my new family members, I believe proper introductions are overdue." David paused, looking directly at me with an expression that mixed love and apology in equal measure. "My name is David Chen, and while I have indeed worked as a server at Meridian, that's not my primary occupation. I'm the founder and CEO of Chen Hospitality Empire, which owns Meridian along with 24 other restaurants and 18 luxury hotels across North America, including the Four Seasons where we're celebrating tonight." The ballroom erupted in applause while I sat frozen in shock. David Chen, CEO, Hospitality Empire. The words swirled in my mind without forming coherent thoughts. "I started working in restaurants when I was 16, David continued, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I built my company from a single location, and I still take shifts at different properties because I believe you can't lead effectively without understanding every aspect of the business." He turned to address me directly, his voice softening. "I didn't reveal my identity initially because throughout my life people have valued my wealth rather than my character. When you treated me with respect and kindness, believing I was simply a server, I knew you were different. You loved me for who I am, not what I own." The room was completely silent, now hanging on every word. "You fell in love with my values, my work ethic, my respect for your passion. You defended me to your family when they looked down on my supposed profession. You loved authentically without agenda." David raised his champagne glass, his eyes never leaving mine. "To my beautiful wife Sarah, who loved the server, not the CEO, I promise to spend my life being worthy of that pure love." The applause was thunderous, but I barely heard it. My mind was reeling, trying to process 18 months of relationship through this completely new lens. Every mystery, every inconsistency, every moment when David had seemed too knowledgeable or too connected suddenly made perfect sense. The man I'd married was a billionaire who had spent a year and a half testing whether I could love him for his character alone. And somehow, without knowing it, I had passed every test. As David sat back down beside me, I found my voice for the first time since his revelation. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He took my hand, his thumb tracing over my wedding ring. "At first, I planned to tell you after a few dates. But then you mentioned how your family judged people by their wealth and status. I wanted to be absolutely certain that what we had was real, untainted by what I could provide, rather than who I am." Looking into his eyes, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, just with a completely different context surrounding him. The kindness was real, the intelligence was real, the respect for my work was real. Everything that had made me love him remained unchanged. What had changed was my understanding of just how much courage it had taken for him to trust me with his true self, and how profoundly Victoria had misjudged the situation when she'd called me worthless for marrying him. As I looked around the ballroom at the faces of Boston's business elite, all of them celebrating our marriage, I realized that Victoria had missed the ultimate revelation of her own prejudice and cruelty. But David and I had found something more valuable than revenge. We had found authentic love tested and proven genuine under the most unusual circumstances imaginable. The weeks following our revelation were a whirlwind of processing emotions I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. David's truth had rewritten our entire relationship in ways that should have made me angry about the deception, but instead left me marveling at the depth of trust we'd actually built. We spent our honeymoon at David's private villa in Martha's Vineyard, a property I learned he'd owned for years but had never mentioned. As we sat on the deck overlooking the ocean, I finally found the courage to ask the questions that had been building since his wedding speech. "How long were you planning to keep this secret?" I asked, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold. David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on my hand. Honestly, I wasn't sure. At first I thought maybe a few months. But then you stood up to your family for me, defended my character when they attacked my supposed profession. Every time you chose me over their expectations, it became harder to risk changing what we had. I felt a complex mix of emotions, understanding his motivations but also recognizing the weight of what he'd asked of me without my knowledge. "You put me through 18 months of thinking I was disappointing everyone I cared about by choosing you over their idea of success." He turned to face me fully, his expression serious. "Sarah, I know what I did was unfair. I tested your love in ways you didn't even know you were being tested. But I also need you to understand something." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've had people claim to love me for 20 years. But every single relationship ended the moment they got what they wanted from my wealth. My ex-fiancé left me for a tech billionaire the month before our wedding. A woman I dated for 2 years turned out to be feeding information about my business deals to competitors." The pain in his voice was real and deep. "When you defended me to your sister, when you told your parents that my character mattered more than my bank account, when you chose to trust me, despite all the evidence that I was hiding something, I knew I'd found something I thought was impossible." I understood his reasoning, but I also needed him to understand the cost of his deception. "Do you realize what it was like, thinking I was letting down everyone who ever believed in me? Watching my family treat you like you weren't good enough, knowing they thought I was wasting my potential?" David's face showed genuine remorse. "I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry for that part of it. I wanted to tell them the truth every single time they made you feel small for loving me. But I was terrified that if you knew, everything would change between us." We talked for hours that night, working through the complex emotions of a relationship that had been built on both genuine love and careful deception. By the time we went to bed, I understood that while David's methods had been questionable, his feelings had been completely authentic. The real reckoning came when we returned to Boston, and I had to face the aftermath of Victoria's wedding day meltdown. Emma filled me in on what I'd missed while we were away. "Your sister's video went viral, Sarah. Someone recorded her calling you worthless for marrying a waiter, and now everyone knows she was screaming at the wife of one of Boston's most successful CEOs." I watched the clips on Emma's phone with a mixture of horror and fascination. Victoria's face was twisted with rage and superiority as she declared me worthless, completely unaware that she was humiliating herself in front of some of the most powerful people in the city. "Morrison Hotels fired her the day after the wedding," Emma continued. "Apparently, her boss was terrified about the public relations nightmare and the potential damage to their relationship with Chen Hospitality Empire." The irony was almost too perfect. Victoria, who had spent years measuring worth by professional success and social connections, had destroyed both in a single moment of cruelty. But the most significant change was at Lincoln Elementary. Dr. Hayes called me into her office the first day I returned to work, her face glowing with excitement. "Sarah, the anonymous donor, has revealed themselves. It's the Chen Foundation, and they want to make Lincoln Elementary a model program for innovative education initiatives." I sat in her office, finally understanding how all the pieces had fit together. David hadn't just supported my career, He'd used his resources to ensure that the work I loved could continue and expand. The funding will allow us to hire 3 additional teachers, expand our arts programs, and create a teacher development initiative that other schools can replicate. And they've specifically requested that you head the new program. That evening, I confronted David about his role in saving my job. You could have told me you were the anonymous donor, I said. I spent weeks worried about my future while you already knew it was secure. David looked sheepish. I wanted to help, but I also knew you'd never accept it if you knew it came from me. You're too independent, too proud to let someone else solve your problems. He was right, which made his deception both thoughtful and manipulative. So you decided to manipulate the situation instead of trusting me to make my own choices. David sighed, running his hands through his hair. Sarah, I made mistakes. I should have trusted you with the truth earlier. But I also can't regret protecting something that matters to you when I had the power to do it. We were still working through these complex dynamics when Victoria finally reached out 3 weeks after the wedding. She called while I was grading papers in our penthouse, her voice small and unfamiliar. Sarah, I need to see you. I need to apologize, and I need to try to explain. Part of me wanted to refuse to let Victoria live with the consequences of her actions without offering forgiveness. But another part of me, the part that remembered building blanket forts together as children, couldn't ignore her plea. We met at a small coffee shop in Cambridge, far from the usual haunts where Victoria might be recognized. She looked like a different person, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said without preamble. What I did was unforgivable. I called you worthless on your wedding day in front of hundreds of people because I was jealous and scared and angry about things that had nothing to do with you. I waited for her to continue, not sure what I was hoping to hear. I've spent my entire life measuring success by Dad's standards, by money and status, and what other people thought. When you rejected all of that and still found happiness, it made me question everything I'd been working for. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in years. It was easier to tear you down than to face the possibility that I'd been wrong about what mattered. The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion Victoria and I had ever had. She told me about the pressure she'd felt to be perfect, about the fear that had driven her need to judge others, about the realization that her pursuit of external validation had left her empty and alone. I lost everything, Sarah. My job, my reputation, most of my friends. And for what? To prove that I was better than you for marrying someone I thought was beneath us. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw someone who had finally been forced to confront the cost of a lifetime of measuring worth by the wrong standards. The question was whether it was too late for her to change, and whether I was ready to help her retry. 6 months later, I was sitting in our penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor watching David review architectural plans for a new Chen Foundation Education Center when Victoria called with news that completed her transformation. I got the job, she said, her voice carrying a happiness I hadn't heard in years. The nonprofit hired me to head their community outreach program. Victoria had spent the months since our coffee shop conversation rebuilding her life from the ground up. She'd started volunteering at literacy programs, taken courses in social work, and slowly discovered that helping others brought her more satisfaction than any corporate achievement ever had. The job pays a fraction of what I made in PR, she continued. But Sarah, I wake up excited about my work for the first time in my adult life. Her new boyfriend was a kindergarten teacher named Michael, who earned even less than she did now, but who made her laugh in ways I'd never seen before. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that Victoria had found happiness by choosing exactly the path she'd once scorned me for taking. My father's story had a different ending. Robert was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for embezzling client funds, and Mitchell & Sons collapsed entirely. The man who had spent decades judging people by their financial worth lost everything he'd built his identity around. Catherine had been forced to sell the Beacon Hill mansion and move to a modest apartment in Brookline. Her social circle had largely abandoned her after the scandal, leaving her to confront the emptiness of relationships built on status rather than affection. But perhaps the most significant change was in my relationship with David. We'd spent months in counseling working through the complex emotions around trust and deception. Dr. Sarah Brennan, our therapist, helped us understand that while David's methods had been problematic, they'd also revealed something profound about the nature of authentic love. You tested whether Sarah could love you without agenda, Dr. Brennan had told David during one of our sessions. But Sarah, you also tested David without knowing it. You proved that your feelings weren't dependent on what he could provide. The Chen Foundation had transformed Lincoln Elementary into a model program that other schools across the country were now replicating. My innovative teaching methods were being studied and implemented in districts from California to Maine, giving me a platform to advocate for educational reform that I never could have imagined. Emma had been promoted to assistant principal and was helping me develop teacher training programs. She often reminded me that the shy woman who'd reluctantly gone to dinner at Meridian 18 months ago had become someone who spoke at education conferences and consulted with policymakers. David had kept his promise to continue working shifts at his restaurants, though now I understood it was about staying connected to every level of his business rather than maintaining a cover story. Watching him interact with his employees, seeing the respect and loyalty he'd earned through genuine leadership, made me fall in love with him all over again. On a crisp October morning, exactly a year after David's revelation, Victoria came to our apartment for our weekly coffee date. She looked healthier than she had in years, her designer clothes replaced by practical outfits suitable for working in community centers. "I need to tell you something," she said as we sat by the harbor view windows. "I've been going to therapy, working through a lot of things about our childhood and family dynamics." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I realize now that calling you worthless wasn't just cruel, it was projection. I felt worthless because I'd built my entire identity around things that didn't actually matter. When you found real happiness, it forced me to confront how empty my life really was." Victoria had learned to measure success by the children she helped learn to read, by the families she connected with resources, by the small daily acts of service that created genuine community impact. David joined us for coffee, and I watched my sister interact with my husband with respect and affection that would have been impossible a year ago. They discussed education funding strategies and community development with the kind of partnership that suggested Victoria had finally learned to value substance over status. As the afternoon sun streamed through our windows, I reflected on how completely our lives had been transformed. David had found someone who loved his character rather than his wealth. I had discovered that my worth wasn't determined by my family's approval or society's expectations. Victoria had learned that real value came from service rather than status. But perhaps most importantly, we'd all learned that authentic relationships require seeing people for who they truly are, not who we think they should be. The little girl who'd been called worthless for helping a struggling classmate had grown into a woman who understood that worth comes from the love we give and the lives we touch. The server who'd been dismissed as having no ambition had revealed himself to be someone who'd built an empire while never losing sight of human dignity. The sister who'd measured everything by external standards had discovered that internal fulfillment was the only metric that actually mattered. As I looked around our beautiful home filled with David's business achievements and my student artwork, I knew that we'd created something rare. A life built on truth, tested by deception, and proven genuine through the hardest possible trials. Victoria's wedding day tantrum had been intended to humiliate me for choosing love over status. Instead, it had revealed the profound difference between relationships based on superficial judgments and those rooted in character and authentic connection. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance or job, only to discover there was so much more beneath the surface? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story reminded you that true worth goes far deeper than titles or bank accounts, please like and subscribe for more inspiring tales about finding authentic love and value beyond society's shallow expectations. Remember, the people who matter don't judge by appearances, and those who judge by appearances don't really matter.